Welcome to lecture 17. In this lecture, we want to review how to advertise default routes with EIGRP. Therefore, after this lecture, expect you to be able to configure default route advertisement with EIGRP. Let's start our today's mission. I'm sure all of you know what is default route, but just for recall, this is the default route for this destination 0.0.0.0 with the subnet mask of 0.0.0.0.0. It means all networks with all subnet masks. We use default routes especially in internet connections. When we need to connect our routers or networks to the internet, we could not write the route to all internet IP addresses, so we choose this address, which means all addresses and all networks. For example, in this scenario, when we configure static routing or dynamic routing, routers knows about the internal routes with the, for example, 192.168.1, 2, or 3 networks. When they want to go to these networks, they use their longest prefix match and use their networks. For example, think that we are in router 3 and I ping the network of 192.168.1.1, which is the IP address of this interface. This router knows that for going to network of 192.168.1.0, if it has two routes, one here and one here, since the longest prefix match says that if you want to go to the network of 192.168.1.0/24, you have to choose this route. Router 3 use this router to reach the network of 192.168.1.0. And if, for example, you ping 4.2.2.4, which is the Google DNS server, router now choose this way, since there is no any prefix which matches with 4.2.2.4, so the router chooses the default route to reach this network. So default routes mostly used in internet connections when we want to reach internet addresses. Now, imagine that we have a small network with 2 or 3 routers. We could write this default route in a static format in all of them with only one command. But think that we have a very large networks with 50 or hundreds of routers. Now configuring a default route could be a difficult job. So we want to learn how to advertise this default route with EIGRP and only configure it in one position, for example in our scenario in router 4, and then advertise it via EIGRP. In this way, it is not needed to configure the default route on all routers separately. We configure it in one position, in one router, and advertise it with EIGRP to other routers. And after that, these routers knows about the default route too. One note. In this scenario, we have only one internet router, so it could be very simple. But for example, if you have more than one router, 2 or more routers, which are connected to internet, what would you do? You choose only one of these routers for advertisement, or you could choose both of them. You could choose both of them and advertise default route via, for example, router 4 and router 5 together. Both of these routers could advertise the default route. Now it's the other router's decision to use router 4 or router 5 as their default route based on the metrics, and they choose the nearest router to reach their default routes. So remember that if you have 2 or more internet edge routers, you could advertise default route in all of them. But how could we advertise default route with EIGRP? There are two major ways. First, define a static route and advertise it with EIGRP. We could do it in two ways. We could advertise it with the network command, and we could advertise it with route redistribution. We configure both of these methods. And the second way is flag an existing route to be used also as a default route. In this scenario, we don't have any default route like this. We have a classful network, which I choose the network 192.168.5.0, and we want to ask routers to accept this route as their default route. We see how I do it. Let's start our configuration. This is our scenario. We have 4 routers, 3 internal networks, a configure EIGRP on these routers, and since I don't have internet connectivity in my lab, I choose another router and change the symbol to a server, and we assume that it is the Google server with the IP address of 4.2.2.4. Router 4 has directly connected with this server, so it could ping it, but router 1, 2, and 3 could not, and we want to make this opportunity for them in our configuration. Let's check our configuration first. In router 4, we have the connectivity with the 4.2.2.4, as you could see, but router 1 does not have connectivity with the IP address of 4.2.2.4. Now we want to configure default route advertisement. So we go to router 4 and check our static route, show IP route. I don't define it yet, so I do it. Now we go to global configuration mode and say IP route 0.0.0.0 with the subnet mask of 0.0.0.0 and choose the fast Ethernet 1/0, which is our interface which is connected to the internet. Let me show you. This is fast Ethernet 1/0. So we write this route, and if we see our routing table, we see that we have static routes which is connected through fast Ethernet 1/0. Now I want to advertise this route to other routers via EIGRP. Let's check our EIGRP. First, show IP EIGRP neighbors. I have one neighbor in router 4. It is true. It is only router 3. And now I go to global configuration mode and say router EIGRP1 and say network 0.0.0.0. It is enough, and I press enter, and now I expect EIGRP to advertise this default route to router 1. As you could see, this is the default route which is come from EIGRP. D means EIGRP, D means EIGRP, and the asterisk means that it is the default route. So as you could see, I advertised the default route via EIGRP. This is true for router 2 and router 3. Show IP route. This is the same as you could see, and in router 3 too. Show IP route. This is the default route which is advertised by EIGRP. Now in router 1, I could ping 4.2.4, which is our internet server. As you could see, I have internet connectivity. The second way is advertising static routes with route redistribution. For this purpose, I restart my scenario in GNS3 and everything gets back to the beginning. Now there is no any default route in our routers, therefore they could not ping 4.2.2.4. As you could see, they could not ping. And now we want to advertise the default route which I wrote here, and it is not here because I restarted. So I write the static route again, IP route 0.0.0.0.0, sorry, fast Ethernet 1/0. And now I want to advertise it with route redistribution. So I'm sure you remember that we do our redistribution in router subcommand mode. We go to router EIGRP1 and say redistribute static. And this is the only command that we need to redistribute the static route that we have routed before. And now I expect that EIGRP advertise this route to other routers, and you could see this is an external EIGRP route because we do it with route redistribution, not with the network command. And this is learned from EIGRP, and it is the default route. And now I could ping 4.2.2.4. 4.2.2.4. I could ping it and the reachability is okay. The third and the final way. flagging a route to be treated as a default route. For this configuration, we need a classful network, which could be between your edge router and the ISP, or you could define a loopback address here and advertise it via EIGRP and tell the other routers to use it as the default route. This network is not the default route with the structure of 0.0.0.0. It has a classful structure, but other routers treated it like a default route and use it for their default route. I will show you in a moment. For this purpose, we go to router 4. Again, I clear my configuration, and if I issue show IP route, you will see that there is no default route. Now in router 4, I go to interface loopback 0, for example, and I choose the IP address of 192.168.5.1 with the subnet mask of 255.255.255.0, and this interface always up, but just to be sure I say no shutdown and show IP interface brief. I see that the loopback 0 is up, and it has the IP address of 192.168.1.5.1. Now I want to advertise it as the default route to the other networks, to the other routers. First, I should go to, let me clear the screen. First, I have to advertise this route via EIGRP, and I go to router EIGRP1 and say network 192.168.5.0 with the subnet mask of, or the wildcard of 0.0.0.255. Now other routers knows about this route, and I want to say that to the other routers that this route is your default route and you have to treat it as a default route with the command IP default network 192.168.5.0 IP default network 192.168.5.0. Remember that this configuration tells to the other routers like router 3, router 2, and router 1 to treat with this network, with this route as a default route, not for router 4. Router 4 knows that this is not the default route. If I issue the show IP route command, you will see that here say that gateway of last resort is not set. Gateway of last resort means the IP address of the next hop for the default route. But if I issue show IP route commands to the other routers, you will see that gateway of last resort is 192.168.1.2 and it is reachable from 192.168.5.0. And you see that this is the default route 192.168.5.0. It has the asterisk. It is the default route which I learned it from EIGRP. And now if I ping 4.2.2.4, you see that there is no any default route with the structure of 0.0.0.0. Now I ping 4.2.2.4 and there is no any default route with the structure of 0.0.0, but the ping will answer and I have the connectivity with this IP address. This is flagging an existing route to be used as a default route, and you see that how we did it. Another verification command on router 4 is show IP EIGRP topology for the network of 192.168.5.0/24. You see that it is from connected and the exterior flag is set. But if I choose this command, for example, with the network of 3, it is also connected, but the exterior flag is not set for this route, as you could see. For this lecture, I only saved the basic configuration without any related configuration for the default route advertisement, and only EIGRP is configured and the IP addresses is configured, and save the commands in the slides for you, and you could experience it yourself. Now it's summary time. In this lecture, first we review the concept of the default route and then configure default route advertisement with EIGRP in 3 possible methods together. I hope this lecture helps you to improve your knowledge and see you in the next lecture.